So, welcome to the Meaningful Jobs Podcast Season 2. I'm your host, Adrian, and today we are really grateful to welcome Paul, who has a media and marketing background, to come onto our show and talk about his passion in his work and how he found meaning in his work. So, welcome, Paul. Hope you're well.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. I appreciate it.
So, I think the reason why I reached out to you is because I saw your impressive work in terms of how you set up your own company, and executed on a lot of a lot of inspiring projects in the marketing and media industries. So, could you maybe talk us through how you got started in this industry?
Yeah, so first off, I live in Texas
Mm-hmm.
and I grew up here my whole life. And when I was about 20 years old, I got a job working for a public policy organization. And
Right.
I was still in college at the time, and I was helping them do legislative work in Texas. And
Mm.
for the next 8 years, I
Mm-hmm.
did some type of legislative consulting or political
Yeah.
consulting for about 8 years.
Yeah.
And through that, I think I just realized I had a natural knack for marketing, and
Mm-hmm.
I guess it just came to me intuitively. And
Yeah.
it wasn't like, oh, I was so great at coming up with these long scale marketing plans. But I think I was really good at just coming up with creative ideas and just trying to
Mm-hmm.
think like, how does a consumer think about things?
Yeah.
And so we've got to launch a lot of videos and viral videos and campaigns and things like that, and really kind of bootstrapped, scrappy type things,
Right. Right.
limited budget, but big impact type stuff.
Sorry, was it like a startup?
Yeah, it was like a startup basically.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
all these things were like, and so I think I specialized in almost this idea of like sometimes I'd be plugged in with another organization,
Mm.
but then I would be in charge of like coming up with brand new ideas and just kind of like self managing an entire project from beginning to end. And I
Right.
might incorporate other people. So like I was working with a handful of companies.
Yeah.
Um, I was doing political consulting, then it was marketing consulting. But
Yeah.
of course, I was basically a one man shop, and I would bring in
Wow.
contractors for different projects that were going on.
Well, so
Um,
it's basically you're like an entrepreneur, a
yeah,
paid
basically like
entrepreneur, maybe.
a paid entrepreneur. And so it's
Yeah.
almost like they would bring me in as like a business consultant just to execute particular projects. One example is
Yeah.
we had this one client in Austin, Texas, and they were like the largest privately owned janitorial company in Texas. So they had like maybe 3,000 employees, 2,000, something like that. And they did commercial cleaning. So like all the
Mm.
high rises in Austin, they did like
Mhm.
80% of the Austin market, 50% of the
Right.
Houston market, stuff like that.
Right.
Anyways, COVID happened, and
Yeah.
suddenly like they realized that there was a unique opportunity where there were all these
Mm.
college kids that were at the top of their classes, but they were in
Right.
certain fields that were no longer hiring. So that might be petroleum engineering, because right, people stopped driving their cars for like a
Yeah.
year.
Yeah.
So petroleum engineering, hospitality. So
Hmm.
like maybe there was this kid that was like in the 99th percentile of his hospitality,
Yeah.
MBA or whatever.
Hmm.
And now these kids didn't have jobs. And
Mm.
so they came to me, one of these clients came to me and said, "Hey, Paul, how do we go about and finding all these kids who are obviously very sharp, very
Yeah.
dedicated, competitive, and they would be great hires in their industry, but their
Hmm.
industry is no longer hiring. How do we
Mm.
find those kids and
Mm.
bring them into our set of companies? Because
Right.
even though our companies have nothing to do with petroleum engineering, we're a commercial, uh, a commercial cleaning company,
Yeah.
but we're looking for leadership talent. How do we get those kids?" And so my job was to come up and figure out a marketing plan. How would we attract those kids? And so we spun
Right.
out this creative idea like, hey, we'll set up this thing, we'll call it Leadership Academy. And
Right.
we launched this program to
But sorry,
identify these kids.
was this entirely your own idea?
Yeah, it's pretty much my idea. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Well, I mean,
Okay.
it was a collaborative idea. Like
Right.
we talked through iterations, and so I was in charge of like launching the marketing campaign, coming up with the name of the thing, figuring out
Right.
the curriculum, and I worked with other people too. I shouldn't take all the credit for it,
Yeah.
but I was in charge of kind of like launching this thing from an idea out into the market within like two
Yeah.
months. And so within 2 months, we launched this thing. I think we had
Yeah.
like 3,000 applicants,
Wow.
and we had a kid, and we chose the top five. And
Mm.
we had the pick of the crop. And so like we had this one kid, and like he had just missed the US Olympic team,
Yeah.
because he was like seed number 4 and they took the top 3 in decathlon. So he missed the
Yeah.
Olympic team, but highly competitive, very sharp guy, got his MBA in business. And he was just a really, really sharp dude. And so we brought him into the program. We had this other guy, and he was like a sharp dude too. He had like, he'd gotten his master's in law, and he had a double majored in chemistry and this stuff and all this stuff. Really sharp kid, but he just didn't have job prospects. And so we got all these sharp kids, brought them in. We did a 1-year class with them, and we showed them our series of companies that we were working with. Because it was not only the janitorial company, there was also a landscaping company that was all owned by the same set of partners. And so I was working for all of them. And in the end, we're now in our 3rd year, about to launch our 4th year of existence. And like of the 15 kids that have gone through our program, I think 14 of them have stayed around to actually stay in our series of companies. And so it's been wildly successful. So those are the types of things that I was tasked with doing. And I know it took a long time to tell that story.
Oh, it's completely fine. I was fascinated by it, and more fascinated by, the success rate of only 5 out of 3,000, basically.
Yeah.
So that's even harder to get into than an Ivy League school, I guess.
Yeah, it's really true. And we had kids from Ivy League applying to our program, actually. Yeah. So we had the captain of the Notre Dame football team join our program. I mean, really sharp guys. Yeah.
So how did you actually find this, passion of yours in marketing?
Yeah, great question. That is a great question. I think I sort of stumbled into it because I think marketing was just a natural fit for me, and I couldn't even really encapsulate why I felt passionately about different things.
Yeah.
But sometimes I could look at someone's marketing and just be, or like, I wouldn't even call it marketing. I would just look at what they were doing and what they were saying publicly to the audience and how they were trying to get customers. And I would just be like, well, that's not compelling. There's no reason. I wouldn't choose your product.
Yeah.
But here's the things that would. And so just some things came naturally. Again, I'm not like a genius marketer, but there's just some things came real naturally. And then I think I always love reading marketing books. And I don't know if you can see the books behind me. Are
they all marketing books?
A lot of them are. Yeah. All of these are marketing books or business books, leadership books. And I love to read these things just for fun. In fact, actually, it goes like, I don't know if you can see my camera. They actually the books go like 3 levels deep actually back in here.
Wow. I just saw 1 level until you showed me the 3 level.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I love reading, and it's like, I love just like reading these books so I could just kind of get a couple ideas from each person. That's why, it's probably great for people to listen to your podcast actually, because just listening to people, like not everyone's a genius, but there might be a couple smart ideas from each guest or each book that you read. And as long as you're kind of like inundating yourself in that culture and that, some things will eventually stick, and that becomes part of your memorandum of operation, your MO.
Because I always think that it's important to find your passion early in your career so that you don't so-called waste time, I guess.
Yeah.
Not a lot of people can do this. And you said you somehow just stumbled into this. So would you say it's more luck, or if you think about it, any instance?
Yeah, I don't know if it's luck. I actually think like God also really helped guide me through this process too. Even though like in retrospect, I can tell God was the one guiding me, but like I don't think I really understood at the time. It's an interesting thing. So I stayed in the political arena for about 8 years.
Oh, wow.
And I was doing marketing type stuff for different political candidates.
Yeah.
But then back in 2018, I got really tired with Texas politics, really burned out. The political arena was no longer healthy for me.
Right.
I think I was taking it too personally. And so I shifted over entirely into business marketing at that point.
Right.
And around the same time, started my own podcast. And I think for me, it was a better fit because now I was actually finding better fit just for my own self, I think, of where my skill sets really aligned clearly. And instead of thinking about candidates, I was thinking about companies, and it was really healthy for me at that point, I think.
So you mentioned quite a lot of big switches within the marketing and media industry. So whenever you make a big switch, do you go through like a decision-making process? Like how do you determine
I do actually. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So when I was in 2018, one of the things was like I was just sick and tired of political consulting. And I knew I had a penchant for doing business consulting, but there was also this thing where I still wanted to be creative and think of my own things. And I've been creating stuff for other clients for years. But now I wanted to create something of my own that I would control the destiny of. And also create something that was long term. And so that's why we kind of thought of the podcast. But the way we came about that process, because I knew I wanted to create something of my own. But I wasn't sure what was it. Was it a product? Was it a course? Was it a community? Was it I didn't know. And so there was a book that I read around that time, which is where.
Oh, you have it here.
Yeah, I have it right here. Actually, it was called "Nothing to Lose, Everything to Gain." And it's a story about a gangster act, a true life story about a gangster
Yeah.
and how he became a business guy and left the gang world and everything.
Mm.
But he had an interesting premise in there, an interesting exercise, which we did, which he said, when you're ever trying to make a major life decision, maybe for
Mm.
business, like I'm going to switch my career path, or maybe I'm going to
Yeah.
start a business. So one of the best things you can do is sit down with a piece of paper, and
Mm.
this is tedious. It's going to take a time, but do this.
Yeah.
Make a huge list and write down 3 categories. Write down a list of your assets.
Right.
So it's basically
Right.
like stuff that you own, your money, your stocks, your bonds, your house, your cars,
Yeah.
anything they have access to. Maybe you've got a friend and they let you use their anything. Just make a list of your assets, and
Mm.
then make a list of your life experiences, things that you're good at, your skills. Like, I
Right.
did this, I did this, I did this. I'm good at that. Da, da. Make that whole list right there,
Yeah.
and then make a list of your relationships, because
Right.
relationships are so important. It's like, I know this person and they do
Yeah.
this. I know this person. I go through your LinkedIn, go through your Facebook. That might take you all day long, because you're probably got 2,000 Facebook friends, a couple thousand LinkedIn friends. Some of them, there's some overlap, but just go through the exercise, because you'll
Yeah.
remember stuff like, oh yeah, I totally forgot about this guy, but
Mhm.
like I'm good friends with him, or I would feel comfortable at least giving him a call and asking for a favor, right? So
Yeah.
go through the exercise. It's going to take you all day.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you're done, then begin looking for kind of broad categories. Like, are there like things that like, okay, these are kind of clusters. Like, hey, it's weird. I happen to know a lot of people in the real estate space, or I know a lot of people in the film industry, or I know a lot of people in the, and just kind of think of these broad categories. And then look for what is your unfair advantage?
Right.
What is it that like you and your life experiences that God has given you is
Yeah.
going to allow you to have an unfair advantage that most other people wouldn't be able to have? So you're
Mm.
looking for those categories. So you're taking, it's basically your asset inventory, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And like after you do this, see what is it that you might be able to do that no one else is going to be able to do the same way with excellence that you can do.
Right.
And through that process, that's how we decided to start the podcast that we have now.
Wow. I can totally feel your passion and excitement when talking about this. And I think I'm, very impressed. Um, you know, your passion, the energy you have, and I always wonder how people can become so involved in what they do and, become really fully immersed in it, aside from obviously the monetary rewards that come with it. So can you maybe talk us through how, you can just
Yeah.
immerse yourself and not
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
about maybe the money?
Yeah, yeah. So when we first started our podcast, so for some context, my
Yeah.
podcast is called Compelled. I
Yeah.
interview people with unique stories how Christ has transformed their life.
Right.
And these are always really interesting stories. We had one lady, and she came face to face with an assassin who was sent to
Wow.
kill her because she was defending Christians in court. We had
Right.
another lady, and she and her husband were missionaries in the Philippines, and they were kidnapped by terrorists and held
Mhm.
in the jungles for a year as hostages.
Mhm.
We had another guy, and he was at 9/11. He was at the Pentagon when
Mhm.
the 9/11 plane hit the building, and he
Wow.
was about 100 feet away from the plane, covered in flames,
Yeah.
burning up, and he was going to die. And
Yeah.
so each of these people have a really unique story of how Christ
Mhm.
transformed something in their life, or how they saw God at work.
Right.
And when I
Right.
say Christ, I mean Jesus Christ, who I
Yeah.
believe is the Son of God. And I know that maybe not all your listeners believe that, but I believe
Yeah.
it, and my listener and my audience does too. So that
Yeah.
was the show that we created, and so that was
Yeah.
something I felt really passionate about. So in 2018, I did this activity, and I was like,
Mm.
okay, I want to do something, and I'm just going to start out with it. It may not
Mhm.
make a lot of money, but it needs to be
Mhm.
something that I'm passionate about, because my passions are what's going to keep me doing it, and hopefully to
Right.
become something that I can continue doing long term, even though it may not make money at the beginning. And
Mhm.
so that's how we ended up deciding to start a podcast, because by doing that exercise, we realized like we had the right connections in different spaces, and we knew the right people that would be great guests. And so we made this podcast, and for the next 5 years, it didn't make money. What I did,
Right.
I mean, it made a little bit of money, but it wasn't like paying my household expenses or anything
Yeah.
like that. So instead, what was going on is that I would still do business consulting for about 9 months out of the year. We would
Right.
save a bunch of money,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
for 3 months out of the year, I would then close my client books, and I would
Yeah.
just work exclusively on the podcast and just do a
Wow.
big long sprint on creating these really high quality episodes. And I had a team I worked with, and we would subcontract them out. And so
Yeah.
we would raise just a little bit of money from our audience and from
Yeah.
donors. And with that money, we were able to cover expenses. But then my living expenses were always covered just by my consulting work I did.
I
And
see.
so I would do 9 months of consulting,
Mhm.
take 3 months off, do the podcast, and then do
Mhm.
9 months of consulting again, take 3 months off, do the podcast. And we did that for 5 years. And every year that we did that, every time we came back with another podcast season, the show would grow more and more and more. And so
Right.
finally, 6 months ago, we finally went full time on the podcast.
Yeah.
And that's what I do full time now. But to answer your question, specifically
Mhm.
the passions, I think it really was I found the right market fit for me, at least, that
Mm.
my passions allowed me to continue working on the show, even though it wasn't making money.
Mm.
And eventually now we've got to the point where now it is making money. We're able to work on it full time.
Wow. Perhaps I should think about this as well. Maybe
Yeah.
focus
Yeah.
on, my podcast for 3 months exclusively.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of, our audience who might be struggling in what they do, perhaps they might earn a lot of money, but they might feel miserable, as a lot of people I've encountered do. Do you have any advice, for them?
Yeah. Okay. So back when I was doing political consulting, like I was making a lot of money, and I'm like I say, I was making a very good income, very good
Right.
income.
Right.
And yet I was at the season of life where I was like, man, I was like so emotionally invested into the outcome of our political clients' campaigns
Hmm.
that if like a mail piece came out that said lies about my candidate, even though they were lies, I would be emotionally upset or disturbed. And
Right. Right.
unfortunately, that would then carry itself over into my home life, right? So like I would come home and I just wouldn't be engaged with my wife because my mind would still be thinking about work, and I would just,
Yeah.
and so it was a really unhealthy. It had become very unhealthy for me. And again, I was making
Yeah.
a lot of money. It was really good, really great income.
Right. Right.
And yet it was not worth the toll that was taking on my family.
Mm.
And so I would just encourage anybody out there, like, hey, okay, well, two things. First off, hey, it's not worth losing family time, because, like, who at the end
Yeah.
of their life says, like, oh man, you're laying your deathbed. Are you
Yeah.
really going to say, like, oh man, I wish I'd spent more time working? Oh man, I wish I'd got, like, another 3 months worth of emails done.
Mm. Mm.
No, no one's ever going to say. Instead, they're going to say, oh man, I wish I had spent more time with my kids when they were growing up. Oh
Mm.
man, I wish I'd made more memories with. That's what they say at the end of their life, right? So
Right.
like life is way too short to spend working in a cubicle doing something that you hate, right?
Mm.
So don't forget, like, your work does not equal your life. Like work should be a tool to enable what you're trying to do with your wife and your kids and stuff like that.
Mm.
So that's one thing I would offer. Second thing I would offer
Mm.
is, even if you do have a deadbeat job and you hate your deadbeat job, before you go out and quit the next day, make
Mm.
sure you're working on an exit plan. Okay. So that's
Right.
what we did with our podcast. Like, even though I wanted to start the podcast, I wanted to quit all the political work, but I knew that if I did that, we could put ourselves in a bad financial bind. So
Right.
instead, I went to all the existing political clients that I had, and I
Mm.
slowly began to turn down political work. But instead, I knew that a lot of our political clients, they also had business work that needed to get done also.
Right.
Because a lot of politicians and political folks, that have aspirations, they have a business side of things, like they own a company or something. That's what it's allowed them now to have the financial cushion to run for political office. So I went to all those guys, and like I would start turning down their political work, but then I'd be like, hey, by the way, hey, I saw this XYZ thing with your business. Hey, can I help you out with this XYZ thing? And because I
Yeah.
already had a relationship in the political sphere, they already knew they could trust me. And so they let
Mm.
me work on business stuff instead. And so I slowly exited the political arena and just
Right.
transferred all my relationships into their businesses instead. I was
Hmm.
able to use that as my financial cushion then to make the
Right.
podcast happen.
Well, I think it's a great point you make, because a lot of people, or a lot of gurus out in the world, might just tell you to follow your passion, but
Yeah,
don't offer you, any sort of plan,
yeah,
right? So
yeah,
I think I kind of touched on this earlier in the podcast, but I did ask like how you sort of formulate a plan to make a change.
yeah.
So, when you try to get off, politics, obviously you were earning a lot of money, but then you had to give up on that. And was there a time where you kind of regretted your decision or kind of questioned it?
Actually, there's never been a time like that. Actually, I think we've always. I mean, there was a time where I thought, like, hey, maybe the podcast isn't going to work. I'm trying to think right now, though. Um, there might have been a time where I was like, man, the podcast growth is a lot slower than I expected. I think that happened our
Right.
very first season. Like, I thought we were going to launch, there'd be this huge audience. No, there wasn't. It was a very small audience.
Yeah.
But I was like, but because I'd chosen something that I was personally passionate about, at
Hmm.
the end of that podcast season, we were doing maybe 300 downloads a week.
Mm.
But I was still really excited about it. I was like, man, I
Yeah.
love doing this. This is really cool. Totally worth it.
Mm.
Even if we only let's do it again. And so, so that's why we decided to do a second season.
I
And our second season, we tripled in size. We ended that season doing about 1,000 downloads a week.
Wow.
And then the third season, we tripled in size again, did about 3,000 downloads a week, and so you could do the math on that. We're now on season 6 now. So yeah.
Well, just a side question. For those who maybe want to start their own channel or podcast, how difficult would you say it is? And, any prerequisites maybe?
Yeah, okay, so here's a couple thoughts. One,
Yeah.
it could be really simple. It could be really easy, right? But it's kind of like this principle, like you get what you pay for, right?
Yeah.
So like if someone wants to start their own podcast, great, good for them. It's really easy to do. But what you got to think about is like, are people going to come? And then are they going to return? Just because you convince someone to listen to your podcast one time, right? You can convince anyone to listen to your podcast one time, maybe, but is it good enough that they'll come back a second time? Not only that, is it good enough that not only will they come back the second, third, fourth, fifth time, but will they also then tell a friend? And so what we did with our show, because there's so many podcasts to choose from, and so there's a lot of other Christian podcasts out there that focus on Christian testimonies too. They share other people's testimonies. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to create something that was good enough that people would come back a second time, and so good that they would then tell their friends. So we had to distinguish ourselves from other competitors in the space.
Right.
Well, what we knew was that a lot of other Christian testimony podcasts, they sat down and got someone's testimony, right? There were plenty of other shows like that, but very few would sit down and really edit the story. So they would, and really make it into an audio adventure. So what we do with our show is we'll go and record like a 2 to 4 hour interview. I will go in person to the guests. So all the guests, even our international guests, they have to come to me in America, or I have to be with them, wherever they're at. So there's a high barrier to entry to be a guest in our show. So it's got to be a really great story, but we'll get really great audio. So our audio quality is better than our competitors. Yeah. And when I say competitors, I shouldn't say like, we're competing against the kingdom of heaven. But it's like, other choices that folks have, right? So we've got better audio quality. Yeah. And then we will edit that 4 hour interview down into about 45 minutes. So we're taking the very best segments and putting it into a story. And then we'll add sound effects and music and narration. And at the end of the day, I and my team will spend around maybe 40 to 60 hours creating a single episode. Wow. And so when we release it, it sounds really, really good. And so when someone's making a choice, like, they've got like a whole bunch of testimony podcasts that they could listen to. They're going to sample a whole bunch of different ones. But when they land on our show, they'll be like, oh, wow, I really like that. That was really fun, right? Yeah. And so the next time they hop on their phone, they want to listen to a testimony podcast, they're going to come to ours first to see if we have something new. And when they tell their friends about a certain testimony they heard, they're more likely to talk about ours. And I think that's why we've had really high organic growth as opposed to other podcasts in the same space. Because yes. So the answer is, could you start a podcast? Yeah, you could. It could be really easy. But if you want your show to grow really well, I think you need to put a lot of time and effort into it. And that's what we've been doing.
Well, thanks for sharing these secrets. I might implement some of these.
Sure.
Oh, just kidding. Well, finally, before we end, I always invite my guests and give them the opportunity to talk about if they are, hiring internationally, locally, because most of my audience base are either looking for new work or looking, to actually move abroad. Yeah. So, could you maybe talk a little bit about, if you're hiring? Yeah.
I am currently not hiring, but some of the clients that I used to work for, they're always hiring, of course. But the program I would recommend for your folks to look into, and I don't know the age of your clients, but is Leadership Academy. Again, it was the particular client I mentioned earlier. Yeah. And so, they're recruiting right now, and they're looking for folks that basically have an advanced degree, right? Maybe a bachelor's, but if they have a master's would be even better. Folks that are really distinguished themselves. And we've had recruits from internationally also, so not everyone just in the United States. Right. So if your folks are interested in that, they could check out the website is leadershipacademy.io.
I'll remember to include that in the description. Just by the way, is this open to absolutely anybody in the world?
It is, but it's gonna like, as you look through the thing, I think it's gonna do a really good job of like kind of self-vetting and showing people like, hey, this is made for me, this is not made for me. So like Leadership Academy, our real focus is on finding folks that are interested in pursuing a career path in the service industry. And that could be, so that could be commercial window washing, commercial cleaning, residential services. But it's not like, oh, I'm going to be a janitor. It's like being as an executive team member of one of those types of companies in that space.
Well,
so that's where we're really focused.
Who don't have degrees, let's say in the US or the UK. What if they like come from, I don't know, maybe like countries that don't have as...
Yeah, we're open to it. Like, so if you want to apply, Because what we're also looking at is we're looking at the body of work. Like, what about this particular person really distinguishes themselves from
Right.
everyone else? So you don't, I mean, just because you have a degree doesn't mean necessarily anything. What
Yeah.
might be more important is like, what are other life experiences that you've got that really put
Right.
yourself apart? So I'll give one example. Our first class of folks that we had this one girl, she applied and she was a standout candidate because
Yeah.
first off, she did have a bachelor's degree in, I think it was like, biochemistry, I think, right? So like,
Yeah.
really sharp, really smart kid. But then she had then worked in the real estate space for like a couple of years, and that was really interesting to us. But then the
Yeah.
most really intriguing thing is then on her resume, she then spent, I think, a year or 2 years working on an oil rig
Oh, wow.
as
Okay.
as an
That's really
oil rig
random.
roused up, yeah, in the
Yeah.
Gulf of Mexico. Like, so she would stay on a station platform working on an oil rig, right? And this is a kid who was really sharp, had a degree in biochemistry, had
Yeah.
worked in the real estate space, but then, and so to us, it was like, wow, this
Yeah.
person's got a lot of life experiences. She's not of hard work at all. She knows how
Yeah.
to work with a bunch of dudes like on an oil rig. She's
Yeah.
really sharp. And for us, that just like stood head and shoulders. Like, okay, this is the type of person we're looking for because she's got
Mm.
a wide variety of experiences. She can adapt,
Yeah.
and she's not afraid of hard work. And for us, that's what we were looking for. So those are the kind of indicators we're looking for. So just because someone that's listening to this show, maybe they don't have an advanced degree, maybe they don't have a
Mm.
degree, and that may be a hindrance, right? Because like again,
Yeah.
we might be processing 3,000 applications, right? And we're going to be looking for stuff that's going to really distinguish yourself. So
Yeah.
if you send an application to us or any other employer, think about ways, like think like a marketer. How are
Mm.
you going to distinguish yourself from anyone else? And so that requires sitting down and thinking about who is the employer first. What are the things that they're interested in? Think about like all the other applications they might be getting, and then think about how in the world are you going to stand out. Can I tell one more story? This
Oh,
is
of
a
course, of course, of
Okay,
course.
so I've got this guy. I don't know him personally, but I love his
Yeah.
books. His name is N.D. Wilson.
Yeah.
He writes fiction. He also writes nonfiction. But the way he got into the space is he had written this kid's book,
Mm.
and it was a fun novel, kind of like a fantasy novel, kind of like Harry Potter.
Yeah.
But it was just like a different series. It was called 100 Cupboards.
You're right.
Anyways, and so he wanted to get into the publishing industry. He had written this great book. He went to a whole bunch of different publishers, sent them his book, and his dad actually was a well-established Christian author. So
Right.
he thought like, hey, I'll be able to get into the Christian book industry because I'll just use my dad's relationships. Well, he
Mm.
sends this book to them. No one's interested in it. And he was like really bummed because no one wanted to read his book and everything.
Mm.
But then he had this random friend of his that he had said, like, hey, bro, I think you might be good. His friend was not a literary agent, but he
Yeah.
thought like maybe his friend would be good at it. And so he said, hey, bro, I heard you're going to be in New York City next week. Can you just take a copy of my book and drop it off with, all these different publishers?
Yeah.
And the dude's like, sure, whatever. And so his friend was at his mom's house in like upstate New York, whatever. And so N.D. Wilson sends
Yeah.
him the book, but the book wasn't like published. It was just like paper, right?
Right.
So his friend uses his mom's printer to print like 20 copies of a 300-page book, right? It's literally like 8.5 by 11 paper,
Yeah.
and it's this big chunk of paper, right? But his friend, who was not a literary agent, wasn't really sure like how do I deliver this to these book companies, and
Mm.
so he saran wrapped the whole thing, just got
Wow.
saran wrapped and took all these book copies and dropped them off at these different book publishers. Well, book publishers receive manuscripts all the time, right? Sometimes they're solicited, sometimes they're not solicited, right?
Yeah.
Just super random. Like, and so they're just drowning in like all these manuscripts that they really got to get around to reading these things. But suddenly, like, oh, here's my pile of manuscripts today. Oh, this one's saran wrapped. I've never seen a saran wrap. What's in here? And
Yeah.
so all these book publishers started like ripping open the saran wrap because it stood
Wow.
out. It was super random. It was weird. It was different. And they started thumbing through it. And so he got a call back. And I think it was HarperCollins, which is like one of the
Right.
biggest publishers in America. I could be wrong. It was either HarperCollins or maybe somebody. It was the publisher for Harry Potter. The
Wow.
publisher for Harry Potter reached out to him and was like, hey, we want to give you a contract on this. And so he like sold like millions of copies of the book down.
Wow.
And it's just because his friend, who was not a well-established literary agent at all,
Yeah.
randomly decided to saran wrap the book copy. I mean, that's crazy, man. That's
Yeah.
crazy. But crazy stuff like that stands out. And stuff that stands out gets attention, and stuff that gets attention gets considered.
Wow. I think well, that encapsulates your career basically, because you are used to thinking of outlandish ideas. Did you get any of your inspiration from this story in your
Not yet, but I'm still
Not
I'm
yet.
still thinking through. Yeah, I'm still thinking
I
through how to
see.
apply that. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for going to my show, and well, wish you best of luck.
Thank you, Adrian. I appreciate it, sir. Thanks for
Thank,
letting me on.
thank you.